today we have with us Dean Yan, and as the typical saying goes, he needs no introduction. Still, just not to be so cold, let me say that Dean is really a giant in this field. He got his PhD in 2003. I checked that. And the most impressive thing that I can read from his 19 pages of full of activities, or at least the most impressive to me, is that together with more than 30 publications, he has advised around 30 students. I think it is an impressive amount of productivity, very good papers, very good students. And here today, we are going to have an example of the quality of his work with the paper that he's going to start talking about right now. Please, Dean, go ahead.
Jesús, thank you so much. I really appreciate this opportunity to present. So let me start off and ask folks to think about networking among new immigrants. So those of us on this call probably don't need to be reminded about the importance of social connections for immigrants. Just, let's think about new immigrants arriving in a new society in their destination. Let's think about permanent migrants in particular. And one of the first things that new immigrants often do is seek out new contacts and form new social network connections. One way they do this is by connecting with organizations of prior immigrants from the same origin places. So here are just some historical examples. For example, the famous Chinese clan organizations for people with the same surname, this one in Singapore from the 19th century. Another good example is immigrant aid organizations in the US, this one for Italian immigrants. Immigrants also seek out connections with locals, and sometimes locals facilitate this networking. Here's an example, one out of many examples, a welcome event for Congolese immigrants in Portland, Maine. Another organization that I had a little bit of contact with during my sabbatical, the Philippine Club de Catalunya, for an organization intended to connect Filipinos to locals in Barcelona. So these are, social networks are clearly important for immigrants. And those of us on this call have contributed to a large literature. Many of us on this call contributed to a large literature trying to elaborate on and provide evidence on the different things that networks bring to immigrants, what kind of values they have for immigrants. There's a lot of evidence that that networks more broadly, and immigrant networks as well, provides financial assistance to new migrants. They provide information to new immigrants. They help in job search. And they provide things like psychological support. So here's an example of a support group of Filipino migrant workers in Japan. Now, one thing that's really striking about these social networks is that they provide all of these services and benefits for members informally, mostly outside of formal institutional contexts. And there's a large literature in development and migration economics on this. What we're interested in this work is to understand what happens when the government or some publicly minded actor like an NGO inserts itself in the middle of this context. So say in particular that the government inserts itself by providing one of these functions traditionally done by networks, say by implementing an information intervention to improve migrants' information. We are interested in how the network responds and how individuals' efforts to expand or use their social networks respond. Does the government effort complement the services provided by the social network, or does it substitute for the information provided by the social network? Now, this is a really important question in trying to understand the impact of the program, the government or NGO program that's trying to help immigrants. We'd like to know how, in particular, the services provided by the social network responds, or the effort that the immigrant engaged with the social network responds. It's possible that the government intervention may complement what the immigrant gets out of the social network, in which case actually the impact of the government intervention is magnified. But it's also possible that the government's intervention, say an information intervention, substitutes for what the immigrant would have gotten out of the social network, in which case there's actually an attenuation of the benefit that the program has on the intended beneficiaries. So, these kinds of offsetting responses in particular are the types of responses we'd be worried about, which would basically potentially make the program not worth carrying out, not make the program not pass its cost-benefit analysis. So that brings us to the paper. Our paper is called Information and the Acquisition of Social Network Connections. You can tell from the title that we're particularly interested in information provided by social networks. And what this is going to be about is trying to understand how a government intervention to help immigrants affects their efforts at acquiring new social network connections. And we're really going to be interested in whether the government program is complementary or substituting for what the immigrants get out of their social networks. This is joint work with Toman Barsbai, Vicky Licuanan, Andreas Steinmayr, and Erwin Tiongson. Toman and Andreas are on the call, and they'll be, as usual, answering all the hard questions. So let me just tell you what we do, in this study. We are interested in the impacts of an information intervention for Filipino immigrants to the US. This program, its goal is to facilitate settlement and integration of new legal permanent residents, LPRs, or green card holders. We ran a randomized controlled trial in collaboration with a Philippine government agency. So the intervention that we're interested in was designed by our team in collaboration with the relevant Philippine government agency known as the Commission on Filipinos Overseas, CFO. And I think we're all happy and pleased that the intervention we designed in collaboration with the government has actually been adopted since then as their standard intervention in this context, but perhaps for reasons that wouldn't necessarily have expected. And it's certainly not, it wasn't because they saw the results of this impact evaluation of this study. We can come back to that. We're going to be interested in the following key outcomes. Settlement, meaning have you taken steps like getting a driver's license, social security card, opening a bank account that is associated with being settled in the US. We'll be interested in employment outcomes, subjective well-being, and as I highlighted at the outset, new social network connections. These are all going to be outcomes that we pre-specified in a pre-analysis plan. I'll be sharing with you impacts on all of these outcomes. So what's the broad context of this? This is the sort of, there's a set of programs out there, information programs for migrants that are quite widespread. So this is one broader relevance of what we're doing. We're focusing on the Philippine government's so-called pre-departure orientation seminars, or PDOS. These are mandated for all temporary and permanent migrants from the Philippines. They're mandated in the sense that you can actually be prevented from departing the country at airports if you don't have evidence that you attended one of these sessions. So it's actually quite well enforced. About 1 million migrants per year go through one of these types of sessions. This is not just a Philippine government thing, but it's something that many other developing country governments have implemented and are continuing to implement. So just in addition to the Philippines, and here's just an image of one of the Philippine sessions. It's easy to find examples of other programs around the world. Here's a program in India for departing migrant workers, a program in Nepal, a program in Uganda, and there are many others that we can point to. So the International Organization for Migration, for example, which many of us here who work in migration know, conducts hundreds of thousands of these types of sessions, over the course of hundreds of thousands in the first decade of the 21st century, continue to do so. But there is no prior quantitative evidence of their impact. So David McKenzie and I wrote a review piece a few years ago in the World Bank Research Observer, documenting what evidence we have for different types of interventions to help migrants. And there's really, at the time in 2015 when we wrote this, and still today, aside from this work that I'm sharing with you now, there really has been no other study providing quantitative evidence on the impacts of these types of programs. So these are, I think everyone on this call probably doesn't need a lot of convincing that this is an important type of program to be looking at. But there's an even broader context that we want to connect to beyond the economics of migration. And this is information interventions more generally. So there are many public and nonprofit programs to mitigate informational imperfections, informational market failures, for example, in health, financial literacy, employment. And the one point we're trying to make in this paper is that we need to consider the impact of these programs in the context of individuals and households, the intended beneficiaries, also in general making their own efforts to fill information gaps. So it's, people don't just sit idly by in the context of imperfect information and not try to fill those gaps themselves. Social networks are an important information source in this context. And the key question one needs to ask, which we think has not been asked enough, is how do information interventions affect individuals' efforts to acquire information elsewhere, for example, through their social networks? And we really need to ask more generally, would informational interventions complement or substitute for individual social network investments through which they might acquire information otherwise? Now, of course, these issues are center stage for new immigrants. New immigrants clearly have, imperfect information on their new societies. I don't think, many people would argue against, that. And they're actively building new social networks. And so the extent to which, so this is a particularly relevant question in the context of immigrant social networks. We think it applies potentially more broadly. So let's dive into to what we're doing. This is the headquarters of the Commission on Filipinos Overseas, the actual institution we're working with in the Philippines. Turns out that all of the information sessions, the pre-departure orientation seminars that we that are part of this project in both the control and treatment groups happen in this very building. Who are our study participants? They are all departing for the US as new green card holders or legal permanent residents. They're all right at the point where they're within a few weeks of departing for the US. Here's a map of the Philippines. If you're familiar with the Philippines, you might be interested in where our study participants are coming from. They are coming from all over the Philippines, and not surprisingly, there's some concentration around Metro Manila and in provinces on the west coast of Luzon Island that have a lot of out-migrants. But they are coming from all over the Philippines, coming to Manila to do these orientation sessions just before they depart for the US. We enrolled them in the study on the morning that they show up for their pre-departure orientation seminar. People don't know what session is going on that particular day. Our study team intercepted people as they were, filling out forms on the morning of their pre-departure orientation seminar. Just some basic facts about these folks. The vast majority of these folks are family-sponsored green card holders, 93.5%. A very small number are work-sponsored. So we should mainly be thinking about these as family-sponsored individuals. Average age is 33. We restricted people in the sample to be between 20 and 50. Just a bit over half female. They're quite a highly educated group, so these are not typical individuals in the Philippines. They have 47% of college or more education. They only about 18% of a US job lined up. So at the outset, before, when we wrote down our pre-analysis plan, we were very, very interested in employment outcomes, whether people would be able to find employment, whether we could help people find employment. Where are they going to in the US? Top destinations, no surprise, are California, 41%, and Hawaii, 17%, and a scattering across other parts of the US. I'm simplifying our treatment conditions here. There's more detail in the extra slides you should have access to. I forgot to say at the outset that I've put in the chat function of this webinar links to various materials that you might want to refer to if you have questions about specific details that we won't be able to get to on the webinar itself. I put links to the actual full research paper, these slides, so you can look ahead if you'd like, as well as all the details on the different treatment conditions on Toman Barsbai's website. So I'm simplifying here. I'll mainly be talking about these two treatment conditions, the control group, which comprises 40% of the sample, and the new PDOS treatment group, which comprises 60% of the sample. If we have time later, I can go into a few different subgroups into which we divided the new PDOS group, but I won't, in the interest of time, I'll only get to them if that comes up in the Q&A. So today we'll be comparing the pooled new PDOS treatments with the old PDOS. We randomized, those of you who are interested in the nitty-gritty details, we randomized these treatment conditions at the date level. So basically when folks showed up on a particular day for their PDOS, only then did they learn what kind of PDOS they'd be attending, either the old or new. Everyone on the same date gets the same treatment. Nobody could have known in advance what treatment they would be getting when they showed up for their PDOS. That was partly under the individual migrants' control, but we're pretty confident that they couldn't have known what they would be getting when they showed up on a particular day. Our standard errors are clustered by PDOS date. So what is this new PDOS what is this treatment that we keep talking about? This is the actual agenda slide that they saw when they attended pre-departure orientation seminar. It covers these topics: preparing for departure, entering the USA, getting settled in the US, building a support network, finding a job, managing finances, and maintaining and strengthening ties with the Philippines. That last part, maintaining and strengthening ties with the Philippines, explains why the government, in addition to just sort of altruism towards these immigrants, is implementing this program. It's seeking to find a way to maximize the impact of these outgoing permanent migrants on the Philippines itself. So the intervention, the treatment involves an expanded pre-departure orientation seminar and a quite comprehensive handbook that we provided to people in the treatment groups. This is a title, the front cover and the contents page of the handbook, basically covering all the same topics. The handbook is over 100 pages. And again, this was designed by our study team in collaboration with the government agency, the CFO. The key point is that the Nupidos, our treatment, is a much more intensive package of information than people were getting in the control condition. This is one of the main figures in the paper where we compare the control condition, the old PIDOS, with the treatment condition, the new PIDOS. The key point is that the presentation was longer, had many more slides, about double the number of slides. It lasted for 2.5 hours instead of 1.5 hours. This is the presentation people attended at the actual session. And the handbook that they were given at the end to take away with them was substantially longer as well, over about 4 or 5 times longer than the small booklet that they got before. So the broad thing you should be taking away is that there's much more information in the new PIDOS and the old PIDOS. In addition, the focus of the information is different. As you can see in this slide, the control condition really gets a lot of information on preparing for departure and entering the US, and not nearly as much about actually what happens once you arrive in the US. And our treatment shifts that focus quite dramatically towards everything that happens after you arrive in the US, rather than just focusing on getting to the US. The other thing we want to say is that we really designed the treatment to try to give immigrants tools to find more information later upon arrival, by referring in the handbook to other data sources, particularly web resources. So we view the information as giving immigrants not just handing immigrants more information, but giving them better information finding tools. So I think that's another really key difference vis-a-vis the control condition. Again, for those of you who are interested in the full details of these different treatments, there's a lot of information in there. The link to Toman Barsbai's website is at the bottom of this slide, and I also sent it in the chat at the very beginning of the call. What did the intervention look like in terms of timeline? The intervention and survey data collection spanned 2014 to 2017. We randomized 112 PIDOS dates in 2014, conducted the enrollment and baseline survey on a rolling basis across those dates. And then we did 3 phone follow-up surveys from 2014 to 2017 at roughly the 7, 15, and 30-month points post-arrival. We conducted proxy interviews of the closest household in the Philippines if the migrant couldn't be reached. And I think in the context of other migrant surveys, we had reasonable follow-up survey success rates. 85% in the short-run survey, that's actually quite good in comparison to migrant surveys. These folks are, I think in a survey context in general, most difficult possible population to try to survey because they're inherently moving or capturing just as they're about to move, with potentially changing contact information, phone numbers, etc. So that we got 85% of the short-run survey, I think is quite good. We got 61% of the long-run survey. About half of all the surveys are proxy interviews, but we find no imbalance in attrition or proxy rates, so we're not worried about selection bias. And all of our results that I'll be sharing with you are robust to time frame, whether you look at short or long run, and whether you look at proxy versus migrant reports.
Dean, may I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Yes. Am I understanding correctly that these PIDOS are accessible to immigrants that have already a visa, so they are already legally accepted in the US?
Yes.
Or does it provide information also how you can get a visa or change your visa from a family visa to an economic visa or something like that?
Yeah, just to be clear, everyone in this sample has in hand a green card, and they are about to depart for the US. So this pre-departure orientation seminar is the last basically the last hurdle that the Philippine government puts in their way before they depart. So they're typically happening within a month of their departure. Okay.
Sorry, I just had a clarifying question on proxy interviews. What do you mean by proxy interviews exactly?
If we couldn't reach the migrant, we called the household in the Philippines that they identified as the closest household to them in the Philippines.
And they would answer the questions for them.
And we surveyed those households about the migrant situation. Yeah. We surveyed, I'm not going to emphasize this very much because we're not finding much there, disappointingly to the Philippine government, but we surveyed households in the Philippines as well that were closest to the migrant in order to figure out whether there were any positive impacts on the families left behind. That was a big part of our survey operation that I'll be devoting no time to in this call. So we submitted a pre-analysis plan before we collected any follow-up data. And I think that ends up being really important. We specified our key outcome variables, specified our hypotheses, ends up being really important in this context, more so than perhaps, well, specifically because we found surprising results. So it's very important for us to be able to say, we had these hypotheses at the outset, these are the outcome variables we were going to look at. This surprising result that we're emphasizing is not something that we have data mined in order to write a paper. This is actually something that we said we were going to look at. We were interested in impacts on travel-related problems in actually getting through US immigration and entering the US. Outcomes related to settlement. Again, this is about having a bank account, social security number, health insurance, driver's license. Outcomes related to employment, so income and job holding, social network connections, and subjective well-being. In the interest of time, I ask if you're interested in all of these outcome variables, aside from social network connections, which we'll be focusing on, to look at the extra slides at the end of this presentation or the paper. But the basic point is that all of these are indices of a number of separate outcome variables. We hypothesized that the treatment would lead travel-related problems to go down, and all of the other outcomes to improve, to get larger in magnitude or to increase. What did we find? We found that travel-related problems indeed went down. The other key result that we'll be talking a lot about is that social network connections actually went down rather than increased. All the other outcomes basically are null effects. They're relatively close to zero and not statistically significantly different from zero. So basically, in contrast to what we hypothesized, the only outcome that went in the direction that we expected was the reduction in travel-related problems. But for everything else, we find for other outcomes related to well-being, employment, settlement, we don't find any impacts, and we find actually reductions in social network connections.
Sorry, very quick. Why did you expect a decrease in the travel problem? Didn't your treatment actually reduce the amount of time you talked about travel and travel-related issues?
Excellent point. Thank you for asking. I didn't ask Giovanni to ask this question. You're absolutely right. I think this was an area where we could have, we included this, frankly, as a key outcome, even though it could have gone either way. We shifted the emphasis from travel-related problems to other aspects of settlement, but we actually provided all of the original information in the handbook. So if we see any positive effect, a reduction in travel-related problems, then it really meant that people were looking at the handbook and using the handbook, and in fact, it looks like they did. So the handbook actually ended up being a better way to convey this information than just the presentation which the government was using for the control group. So I think that's a strong indication that people actually were using the handbook. Thank you for asking. So coming to the social network index, I just want to be specific about what this measure is. We construct a standardized treatment effect from two component variables. The first, the number of new friends and acquaintances. The question is, how many new people in the US have you got to know on a personal basis since your arrival in the US? And secondly, an indicator of connection to local Filipino or immigrant organizations of Filipinos. An indicator that you received support from a Filipino club organization. The question is, have you received any support, information, help to find housing or work, etc., from a Filipino community or diaspora association in the US? So we use standard methods to create a standardized treatment effect. We just basically normalize each of these components by its mean and standard deviation, take the average, and then normalize the average by the mean and standard deviation. So this index has mean 0 and standard deviation 1. This is pre-specified, as I mentioned. From the standpoint of the network literature, we can think of just to connect this to the literature and social networks, the number of new friends variable, we can think of that as corresponding to the number of first-degree network links. Sometimes referred to as simply as degree, the degree of a person's network. So here's a
Sorry, Dean?
Yeah.
Can I ask you a question? So your question kind of refers to new friends, new network members. Do you have any question about the total size of the network? Because I'm thinking, like maybe these guys, for some reason, they got already more networks by the time they left, just because in the treatment they empathize more with their colleagues taking the treatment and something like that.
We don't have, a lot of good information about people's baseline networks or existing networks. Now that of course should be, because of randomization, that should be equal across the control and treatment groups. So yeah, unfortunately, we can't do that.
But what I'm thinking is, in the treatment, you're talking to them about the importance of making connections and having network and so on. And maybe that day during the course, they can say, oh, okay, so let's get each other's contacts. But then when they respond to this question, because it asks how many new contacts did you make once you are in the US? I mean, they don't count these colleagues that they did during the training.
That's an interesting point. We don't have information on that. I doubt that's what's going on. People tended to really not want to hang around these sessions. I mean, they were typically very busy and typically viewed these sessions as an imposition by the Philippine government of a requirement they didn't really care about. Like I said, these things were mandated. People had to go through them, but I think they had every intention of getting out of there as soon as possible, not socializing and making new friends in the actual session. So it's possible, but I doubt that's actually what's going on. Okay, so on this slide, we basically have a graphical representation of the impacts on the different outcome indices. The diamond is the point estimate, and the horizontal blue bar is the 95% confidence interval. And the reduction in the network index is really the only one that stands out quite dramatically. There's also a reduction in travel-related problems that I mentioned before. But for everything else, the settlement index, employment, subjective well-being, the effects are quite close to zero, not statistically significant. Here's the regression version of those results. This is one of the main sets of results in the table: reduction in travel-related problems and a reduction in the network index. As I mentioned, I already mentioned to Giovanni before that the reduction in travel-related problems reveals the importance of the handbook itself and not just the presentation. The negative effect on this network index, I should point out, is it's important that it's statistically significant after multiple hypothesis adjustment with a p-value of about 0.03. So that's really important. We have multiple outcomes here. It's important that we pre-specified them, but we also need to adjust for the fact that there are more chances to get a statistically significant result because we have multiple outcome variables, and that's significant at the 3% level. I'll just plug our co-author Andreas Steinmayr's data module for doing this multiple hypothesis correction. He designed this because we needed to do it, basically implementing the list et al. Method with control variables. So the list et al. Method that's on Stata right now doesn't allow you to include control variables in the regression, and Andreas's does. So please use it. It's very it's great. Andreas is not earning anything from this, but it's a really useful package. So these are the short run results. Results after 7 months in the US. As I mentioned earlier, all of our results are robust to the longer time frame if you look over 30 months, as well as if you just pool all the data from all the post-treatment surveys. I won't show you that regression table in detail, but we can turn to it in the Q&A if people are interested in. What I'll show you in terms of the 30-month effect is just a different way of looking at the impact on the social network. So this is just focusing on the number of friends and acquaintances outcome variable after 30 months in the US. These are probability density functions for the people in the old PDOS, the control group, and the new PDOS, the treatment group. The old PDOS is the solid line, the new PDOS is the dashed line. We're also showing the median values, and there's clearly a shift in the density towards the left. The full distribution of the number of friends and acquaintances shifts towards the left for people in the treatment group than in the control group. And you can get a sense here as well of the median values. So people typically in the control group typically report about 30 friends at median, whereas in the new PDOS they're reporting more like 25. So that's sort of the magnitude of the shift. So I focused almost entirely on the empirical results. Now I want to step back and say, let's talk a little bit about theory. I think there's been some theory implicit in everything that I've mentioned, but this was an unexpected result. What might explain it theoretically? This seems like another reason to go in the theoretical direction. We're not doing anything incredibly complex here, but just to think theoretically a little bit. Even though this might be bad news for information and interventions for migrants, if we think a little bit about theory, we might be able to think about subpopulations for which the impacts might be more positive. So we write down a simple model just to illustrate the possibility of this effect. And let me just be clear that we didn't think about this model at the outset of the project. It was only something that we started thinking about once we saw this surprising negative impact on social networks. I think it makes sense simply to think about immigrants getting utility from the extent to which they're able to integrate in their new society, but they have imperfect information that's relevant for their integration. We can quantify that with a parameter theta. Higher theta means more imperfect information. Lower theta means better information. People have social networks. Think about friends with number of friends F that helps alleviate, and these social networks help alleviate imperfect information problems. They help you reduce data, but acquiring friends is costly. I think you might just think about the cost of socializing or the cost of networking. I think if you think from in a sort of professional standpoints, it's not unusual to think about networking as something you have to make efforts at. And so I think from that standpoint, it's natural to think about acquiring new friends and contacts as costly. And very simply, we think we can think about migrants choosing their optimal number of friends, equalizing the marginal benefit with the marginal cost of friends. In this context, we can ask, what's the impact of a treatment that reduces theta? And this is such a general framework that anything is possible. But the only point we want to make is that it's certainly possible for an informational treatment like the one that we provide that reduces theta to either lower or raise acquisition of friends depending on parameter values and functional forms. So in other words, information and friends can be either substitutes or complements. Substitutes meaning that providing exogenously more information to the person reduces their investment in friends, whereas complements would mean that if you exogenously provide someone with better information, they may actually complement the friend acquisition and lead them to acquire more friends. So, again, we're simply thinking about the marginal benefit of friends as being represented as in this case, it would be something like this green downward sloping line, marginal benefit declining in the number of friends. Think about a constant marginal cost of friends for simplicity. We're trying to figure out the optimal number of friends, and for this person, it's something like F star 0. Now think about an informational treatment that reduces theta. This is the case of information and friends being substitutes. We can think about information that reduces theta, reducing the marginal benefit of friends, leading us to shift inwards, shifting the marginal benefit function inwards to the orange curve, leading to lower optimal friend acquisition F star 1. So again, this is just one out of other. There are many possibilities. There's also the possibility of complementarity, which we're not illustrating here, but which we go through in the paper. Well, how do we think about the utility gain from treatment if people respond in this way? Well, when people respond to a treatment like providing exogenously more information by reducing friend acquisition, that attenuates the utility gain from the treatment. In contrast, if friends were exogenous or for some reason fixed or unchanged by treatment, the utility impact of the treatment would be higher. And I think that the intuition is pretty clear here. People in the absence of the treatment we provided, people were investing in friends, bearing the cost of acquiring new friends, getting information from their social network. Once we provide the information, people reduce their investment in their social network, enjoying lower costs of friend acquisition, but basically getting the information from our intervention instead of from their friend network. And on net, the utility gain is attenuated. This leads us to be able to think about, again, in this simple model, are there situations where friends might be relatively exogenous and unchanged by treatment? This is basically searching for a context in which an informational intervention might actually be helpful. And the model suggests that we might think about situations where the cost of acquiring friends might be higher. For example, locations with fewer prior immigrants. If the cost of acquiring friends is higher, people may acquire fewer friends, and there might be fewer, if any, new friends to displace by providing immigrants with information. And because there's less displacement of social network provided information, then treatment provided information potentially has greater net impact. Theory motivated us to think about this and led us to look at heterogeneity of the treatment effect with respect for a proxy for the friend acquisition cost, which is the number of Filipino-born prior immigrants in the US county that they're destined for. So if you happen to be going to a US destination that has very few immigrants, few prior Filipino immigrants, it's probably harder for you to make friends. So the prediction would be if we focus on in subsets of immigrants that are going to places with relatively few Filipinos, it's possible that the impact of our treatment might actually be positive instead of 0. And that's exactly what we find. So what we're looking at here is we do non-parametric estimates of the treatment effect, the sort of central solid blue line with 90% confidence intervals. The horizontal axis is a measure of the number of Filipinos in your county, the inverse hyperbolic sign of that to reduce the influence of outliers. And what we can see is that the impact of the treatment on well-being is actually positive and statistically significant for immigrants in roughly the bottom quintile of the county Filipino population. So it actually does, let me just say at the outset, this was pre-specified, this is exploratory, not in our pre-analysis plan. I should say not pre-specified, this was not in our pre-analysis plan. But it was a direction that we went once we wrote down the simple theory and realized that there might be some subpopulations where information might actually be beneficial. And again, the intuition here we think is pretty clear that when there's less scope for substitution, when sort of people aren't able to make a lot of friends to begin with, then information exogenously provided by an intervention can actually potentially be more impactful, have more impact on people's utility. Okay, so what are our takeaways here? I think to step back, we think this work is related to prior research in other contexts that emphasizes that the impacts of social policies can sometimes be offset by behavioral responses on the part of intended beneficiaries. So some other examples that that are important to mention, for example, what's sometimes referred to as the Peltzman effect. You have policies to reduce risk that leads to more risk taking by the intended beneficiaries. For example, seatbelt policies might lead to riskier driving. Another context that's sort of widely known in development economics, if government provision of a private good could simply replace private purchases of that good. Filmer, Hammer, Pritchett have a important paper where they make this point in the context of public health investments in developing countries, emphasizing that it's really important for the government to invest in public goods than in private goods that people might be purchasing themselves from the private market. If you focus on providing private goods, then you might simply just displace private purchases, and that attenuates your net impact. Some recent papers that we cite in our paper, have a look at them. There are a few of them, document that microfinance interventions in savings, credit, insurance, also reduce social network connections. There can be some behavioral responses, more in line with what we're finding in this work. So our point here, again, is that we should also worry about offsetting behavioral responses to information interventions. The information that is provided by the intervention might substitute for network provided information. We also, show in some exploratory analyses that there's actually a glimmer of hope, even though the overall message I think is bad for the Philippine government's, this program that the Philippine government is implementing on a quite massive scale. It does look like information interventions may have positive impacts in situations where you might expect less social network response, less reduction in social network investment, in particular immigrants who are going to places where there are fewer prior Filipino immigrants. So if the government wanted to target its intervention towards that subset of migrants, then it could have a more consistently positive impact. So I think the final takeaway would be, when considering informational interventions among migrants and elsewhere, we need to think carefully about whether beneficiaries will respond by reducing their informational acquisition from other sources, such as their social networks. So I'm going to conclude there, and very much looking forward to the discussion.
Okay, thanks a lot, Dean. This is perfect timing. So let me abuse my position and lead with one question that has been asked by several people in the chat function, which is the quality of the network. Your measure of the network seems to be quantity oriented, the number of friends. So many people have been asking whether you can say something about the quality of this network.
Yes, great question. Toman, I see you turned on your video. I'd be happy to let you address that. We actually addressed that pretty explicitly, but in the appendix rather than in the main text of the paper.
Okay, then I'll take over. So we have only limited information about the quality of networks. So what we do have is we can distinguish between Filipino friends and non-Filipino friends and close friends of individuals. And basically we see reductions across the boards. And you might think of close friends as, being friends that you interact with more closely, more frequently. So there's, some quality component here. We also have more detailed information on the two most important contacts they have built in the US, but it's only restricted to 2 individuals. And there again, we see no differences in the education levels of those folks, their age or occupation. So given this probably still limited information we have on the quality of the network, we don't really find any any evidence that there are, significant differences across the treatment and control group.
Okay, thanks a lot. I have one question from Michelle. So Michelle, please go ahead.
Yes, I thank you very much for the paper. I had a question about the heterogeneity in the treatment effect. So trying to understand what is behind the size of the diaspora. So is it a story about search costs? So basically the lower the diaspora, the higher the cost will be to find friends, but also another story about if you have a small diaspora, I mean, you have a lot of institutions that are not going to exist at destination, so clubs and so on. So basically, I was thinking about maybe there are non-linear effects explaining maybe this heterogeneity in the treatment. So have you thought about that?
I think no, that's an excellent point. I think we're pretty clear this is just an exploratory analysis. It's certainly consistent with the story that we're telling, but it's not necessarily the only story. I think what you're bringing up is the possibility. I mean, clearly there are omitted variables correlated with the size of the Filipino population in your county of destination in the U.S. So most Filipinos are going to California and Hawaii, where there are lots of Filipinos. But if you happen to be going to Michigan, where I am, or North Dakota, there's clearly many ways in which Michigan and North Dakota are different from California. You mentioned the presence of Filipino organizations, although I view that as sort of going hand in hand with the number of Filipinos. I mean, that just is something that reduces your cost of acquiring new friends. So I think we view this as something that further the research should push towards in the future. I think the broad point is still that there's heterogeneity in the size of this treatment effect. We can debate whether it's because of the number of Filipinos or other things that are different in Michigan or North Dakota compared to California. It may be that if you're going outside traditional Filipino migrant destinations, we'd have to check to see if this is true. But it may be that you're highly educated, maybe you have a more specialized occupation, maybe you have better ability to find information. I don't know if that would go in the same direction. Actually, that sort of there could be a lot of things that are pushing you to have more positive responsiveness in terms of your well-being towards in response to informational intervention. But I think this is something that we need to push in future work.
Okay, so Simone also has a question, and then Chaglar. Please, Simone, go ahead.
Thanks, Jesús. Dean, a quick point. I was wondering whether the fact that you provide information to migrants can change their own perception of who's a friend, in the sense that someone giving you a valuable piece of information becomes your friend. But given that now that the bar is higher, because they already have more information, they might think that fewer people are giving them valuable pieces of information and hence regard them as friends.
Mm-hmm. I think we can't rule that out directly. If I had to guess, I would say that's probably unlikely, just thinking about how people are likely to be responding to this question. But I think we can't rule that out. One thing we can say is that the effect is not being driven just by that piece of the network index. If you recall, there are actually two variables that are in the network index. One is the number of friends and acquaintances that you report, but the other is whether you have any contact with and get support from Filipino organizations. And both of those pieces decline. It's not just the index overall or just the number of friends. It's also that people seek less help from Filipino organizations. So I think that sort of suggests that even if that's what's going on for the number of friends variable, it doesn't explain the other effect.
Thanks, Dean.
So Chaglar, please go ahead.
Yeah. Thanks, Dean. This is really interesting. The question I have is the following. I mean, the people who are in your sample are extremely biased. Not only they're highly educated, they also have permanent green cards, right? So this is not the average Filipino migrant when we're talking about that's leaving the Philippines. So is it possible, I mean, there might be two possibilities. One is maybe your social circle, there's like an upper bound and everybody's close to there. So, or all the other variables, right? They just don't need the help as much. So the intervention doesn't have any impact. And on the social aspect and the networking effect, maybe they realize, like you go to the US without any knowledge, and then you say, oh, let's see what the Filipino Association can teach me or can provide for me. But once you provide that information, they realize, you know what, this is useless. I'm not going to waste my time, because they are really at that end, because they have other sources of, their family and professional circles. But this wouldn't apply if you were a construction worker going to the Gulf or a nurse coming on an employment visa and going to the middle of nowhere in Kentucky.
I think this is a valid point that these folks are, we need to think about the characteristics of these folks. As I emphasized earlier, they are relatively highly educated compared to the vast majority of migrants worldwide. They're certainly not like temporary contract worker migrants. I think, of course, they are representative, I think, of permanent migrants with green cards. This is going to be a select population. I think that, we view this paper, given what the outcomes ended up being, I think we view this paper in some ways as an existence proof that this type of effect is possible. How might it, I think whether we would see a similar effect in other migrant populations is an open question. I think this sort of reemphasizes the need to do this kind of study in other migrant populations like migrant workers. The Philippine government, like I said earlier, conducts 1 million of these EDOS sessions and provides information per year. Only a small minority actually are the ones that we look at, the permanent migrants. The vast majority of them are going to temporary worker migrants going to the Middle East and elsewhere. And those programs have not been evaluated at all. If you ask me, I think if anything, these patterns should be potentially even more pronounced. Well, actually we don't know, but they could even be more pronounced in the migrant worker population. They could actually, if they rely even more on their social networks than do permanent migrants, because they have few other sources of information, we might actually see even bigger reductions in their social networks in response to the government giving them the information. But we don't know. I think this should open the door to to further studies. I think those would be very valuable, looking to see whether this kind of effect pans out in other migrant populations.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so Giovanni, please go ahead with your question.
So actually is a little similar to Chalar. I was surprised. So 95% are family reunification, which means that they have one very close network already present. They are often a spouse, I assume, who has her or his own network. I'm thinking if for this group, the cost of having new of linking with the new and different people relative to the network they already find is higher relative to the benefit. I assume that will be the family person who will help them for an account. So I guess what I'm saying is that would be very interesting. So how come actually to start with, there is no such a thing for people who live on a temporary visa or on a seasonal visa or on who seem to be even more in need of this type of meeting to begin with, and if there is a intervention on that possible at all?
Just to be clear, the government does implement these sessions for temporary migrant workers as well. They're not the subject of our study, so I think they're important to do as well. I think that the fact of the matter is we were surprised by this result. I think I made that clear. But I think ex ante we would have thought, why isn't the sponsor, the green card sponsor, a good source of information for people? Why should clearly I think our results should change our priors and basically say that it's not just the original green card sponsor, but other people as well in one's broader social network that new immigrants rely on for information. I think a little bit of introspection probably should lead this to be not too crazy an idea. I mean, how much of us rely just on our spouse for all information about the world, or just on one close person? I think we might rely on many different people for information of different sorts, and immigrants should be no different than that. Looks like Johan has his hand up.
Okay, Johan, please go ahead.
Yeah, so thanks, Ian. It was a very nice paper and presentation. So I was thinking in terms of your, like your simple model and your welfare, thinking about this, which I like because I think it's, it sounds like it's the direction where probably this result is coming from. But then if you think of this, like having friends being costly and therefore this information program just saving you the effort to have friends. I mean, not that I don't like having friends, but in terms of your welfare analysis and this graph that you showed afterwards, should we also be observing an increase in well-being in the sense that, you just now give this costly item for free?
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I think from a theoretical standpoint, people should still be better off, even if they substitute away from social network provided information towards the government provided information. So there's no sense in which people should be worse off, and there should be a positive effect. I think, we didn't anticipate this effect. Therefore, our study, from a purely experimental design standpoint, was underpowered to detect, the attenuated yet still positive effect that results when people have these offsetting behavioral responses to our intervention. All right, so I think you're absolutely right. There should be a positive effect. I don't think this is harming people, but it's not having nearly as big an impact as it would if people just had fixed friend networks, and if you could somehow rule out the offsetting behavioral response. So if we were to, not knowing what we know now, we would have had to propose a much larger sample size in order to detect the positive effect that is probably there.
Okay, any other questions? So while other people think about further questions, let me go back to something you mentioned at the beginning of your intervention. So you said that the government had adopted your program. What did you mean there? So what did the government adopt from here? The large manual, or please go ahead.
The government essentially, soon after we started, or basically soon after the end of the intervention period, after we allowed them to change things, they went ahead and basically just used only our program, instead of transitioning in some gradual fashion or waiting a bit for our results before abandoning the old status quo. Let me just show you the sort of slide here. Basically, the thing that convinced them was we implemented a very simple survey at the very end of both the old and the new PDOS. The paper survey. We asked people what they liked about it on many different fronts, and basically the new PDOS, which is the orange bars in this graph, was for every outcome that we asked about, much more appealing, was ranked much more highly than the old PDOS. The only thing that was different is the discussion and interaction, which was in the middle here, because we really packed a lot of information in, and so people didn't get as much time for discussion and interaction. But basically, this was even before seeing the results of the study, the government just decided to go ahead and implement the new PDOS wholesale for everyone. So, I'll tell people this is like the fastest policy impact I've ever had for any study that I've done, but they didn't even bother to wait for the results of the evaluation, to actually wait for the impact on well-being and employment or anything else. They just decided to go ahead. Yeah, we actually met with them last January, shared with them this same presentation, and actually shared with them these results. I think it gave them some pause to realize that they weren't having the big impacts on well-being that they anticipated, but they were happy to see that at least for a subpopulation, people without a lot of Filipino community in their locations to begin with, there seems to be evidence of positive effects. We'll see if it remains to be seen whether these results will percolate naturally through the Philippine government and lead to further changes in policy. Yeah, we don't know, but that's the story.
Okay, thanks. So we have one more question from Clement. Please, Clement, go ahead.
Thank you. It's more of a comment. So I was chatting with Andreas, who referred me to the appendix table I was looking for. So basically, when you look at the effects, dropping the observations that are coming from these proxy interviews, you have more positive effects, I think, on settlement in the short run and even employment. They're not big and they're not necessarily very highly significant. I just wanted to, especially because you have this discussion of welfare towards the end. So I think it might be important to, because welfare is only measured through those direct interviews when you're actually talking to the migrants. But then some of the outcomes are sometimes measured using the proxy interviews as well. I think it might make sense maybe as a baseline to have the outcomes measured on the same sample, which is the migrant one. And then maybe adding some more information, but it seems to be changing things around a bit, at least.
So I think we lost Dean, so I'm not sure if... Okay, so yeah, so we are going out of time anyway. So I guess, Clement, they can get back to you. So Dean is back. So let us maybe give him the chance to say goodbye. No, I don't see him again. Oh, no, yeah, Dean, you're there. I'm not sure if you got to see...
I'm sorry, we had a power outage.
Wow. Okay, so you can get in touch with Clement with his question and the one remaining question in the Q&A. Thanks a lot for attending the seminar. To participants and panelists, thanks a lot, Dean.
Thank you
for handling the questions.
Bye.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
See
Thank
you
you,
next
everyone.
week with Joan Jule. Bye.
Bye-bye.